last night at midnight, I started this counter. So it's a little piece of software running, and it's roughly approximating the number of photographs or pictures that have been uploaded to the internet since midnight of last night, just today. And these numbers are taken from estimates from Flickr, public sites, and also private sites like Facebook and things like Instagram, to guess how much photography image is being uploaded to the internet every day. And it's a big number. And to put it in perspective, in terms of history, 10% of all photographs ever taken have been taken in just this last year. So this is photography has 100, 200-year history almost now, and now we're double making massive contributions to the database at every day. And I'm curious what this means for photographers, what it means for people who think of photography and image making or cinema as an artistic practice. And so I've been tracking photographers who are playing with this idea. So one such photographer is named Penelope Umbrico, and she has this ongoing project that she actually started in, I think, 2006, called Suns from Sunsets. And she just searches on Flickr for the word sunset, downloads the photo from somebody, extracts the sun, and then prints it and puts it onto these large gallery walls. And I think it's a nice project because although all the pictures are taken from different places and are taken by different people, they're taken out of context and they show the one thing that we all share together on this earth, which is this view of the sun. Another more blunt project is by Eric Kessels, who's also a photographer by trade, and he has a project also using Flickr called 24 Hours, where he takes every photo that was uploaded to Flickr in a 24-hour period, prints it, and drops it in a gallery. And what I love about this is if he would use Facebook instead of Flickr, he would need 385 times the space, because for every Flickr photo that's uploaded, 380 are uploaded to Facebook. So he'd need a bigger budget for that installation. And it probably would be a lot more interesting because they're not all public photos. So by way of introduction, my name's James George. This talk is called Imaging the Future. And my background is actually trained as a computer scientist, but I work as a visual artist. And I'm very collaborative. I'm interested in image making and image algorithms. And in order to do that, I work a lot with photographers and filmmakers. And I want to actually start not talking about myself, but talking about my closest collaborator. His name is Alexander Porter. He lives in Brooklyn. We share a studio together. His background is much more of a traditional photographer. He studied media and photography. And when I met him, he was making photos like this, like very classic editorial photojournalism. And he had just moved to New York. He was doing street photography, the history of Vivian Maier, kind of in that light. And he was very talented in this and quickly got swept up into the sort of social life scene in New York and started doing event photography and had built a very enviable portfolio of famous people that he'd photographed at these different events or cultural institutions. Chuck Close, Bill Clinton, other people you recognize. And his portfolio just goes on and on and on. He signed a contract with a really exclusive agency and was really making it as a photographer in his mid-20s. And everything kind of came to a head when he was invited to go on this tour with Rihanna. It happened a few years ago. It was a 777 tour. She rented a Boeing 777. It was 7 countries in 7 days, 7 different shows, a show every night. And a crew of journalists were exclusively handpicked to join Rihanna on this plane and travel with her to document the tour. And so this was a big deal for Alexander. And on this tour, it didn't quite go as he had planned. It wasn't what he had expected. It ended up that they had no access to the pop star herself. And the journalist, being crammed into this jet, sleep deprived, not given food, ended up having to create their own story. So the headlines that came out of this had nothing to do with Rihanna's show, but had to do with other journalists streaking through the cabin and people throwing up, people passing out. So it ended up being this completely self-recursive, disastrous period, and it was very disruptive for Alexander, who wasn't participating in any of this. At least that's the story he told me. But being his friend and being a media artist, before he left on this trip, I gave him a book to read. And it's a very short book that was actually written in the 1980s by a media theorist called Willem Flusser. And it's called Towards a Philosophy of Photography. And so Alexander's reading this book while all this crazy stuff is going around him. And it actually got at the core of what he was starting to feel, this discomfort with his practice, with his career. And so in this book, Willem Flusser lays out the problem with modern photography. And granted, this is written in the 80s when he's talking about photography as like snapshots. You can think like Polaroid cameras, but it still was at a much more massive scale then than it had been in history. So it was on the beginning of this incline. And Willem says that in this age, constrained by the limits of the possibilities of a given camera, that a photographer is working within that constraint. And even though you can always take a new photograph, you can't really, in a lot of ways, it becomes very difficult to contribute new information to the world, like make something that's generally novel or really expands the discipline, as Alexander was interested in doing. And so he sets that up as a problem in the book. And then the antidote to this is this concept of an experimental photographer. And by definition, an experimental photographer takes into question the apparatus itself. Like they don't take the camera for granted, but they try to break it or subvert it or invent it differently in order to generate images that have never been seen before and contribute to the discipline. And with the combination of these two events, this new philosophy that Alexander was exposed to, and then this terrible scene around him, he had a bit of a breakdown, and he took his otherwise illustrious career and it lost all of its gloss, and he essentially, it felt like a trap, and he threw it away. So this was a photo that I had found for him when we were having these conversations, and it's a young British artist, Stephen Pippin, or part of the YBA movement, and he would rig the shutter of a camera to the trigger of a gun so that when he shot the camera, it would take a photo of its last moment. And that's essentially what Alexander did to his career. He stopped taking on contracts. He joined me in the studio, and we essentially started collaborating together in full, and really asking these questions like, where is this discipline going? How can we contribute to the medium? And we sort of centered our discussions around this concept. What is the camera of the future? Like, what is this new apparatus? And I had seen a few things along the way that had given me this idea, that prompted this question in my mind. And one of things was a talk by this guy, and I've tried to paraphrase this quote, but I'm not good at it, so I'm going to play a clip. But for those of you who aren't familiar, this is Bruce Sterling. He's along with William Gibson, he invented the concept of cyberpunk in the 80s, which was very prescient towards what the internet what's happening with the internet now. So he's a science fiction author, and more recently, he's been considering himself a design critic or maybe a design fiction author, thinking about the immediate effects of technology on culture. And in this talk, he rambles on about this idea of the camera of the future. What will cameras look like in the future? And he has a nice quote that I'll play for you now.
They would look something like this microphone, except probably a lot smaller. And this thing here, the head of the microphone, would be the lens, except it's not a lens. It's just a piece of black fabric or glass. It's an absorptive surface that simply absorbs every photon that touches it from any angle. And then in order to take a picture, I simply tell the system to calculate what that picture would have looked like from that angle at that moment. You see? I just send it as a computational problem out into the cloud wirelessly.
So seeing this blew my mind, because it took this idea of photography, which is thought of as this decisive act where you take a picture in the moment and that represents the physical reality, and turns it into something that's more like a search on Google, like a query, where you query for a certain time in time and space, and it's like an active data visualization, you generate a photograph. And we were inspired by this idea and thought maybe we could start to make experiments with this, that maybe there's a way to start creating artwork that hints at this potential future. So this was around the talk and this project were around the same time that the Microsoft Kinect came out. And when I saw the data from the Microsoft Kinect, it was designed as a video game controller. It was Microsoft's response to the Wii in a way. But it had a very special type of camera in it. And that camera, it's a depth sensor, so it sees instead of color, it sees the spatial information in front of it, actually starts to be a little bit like a sliver of what Bruce Sterling was talking about, this camera of the future, the ability to take a different picture from a data set, but it's still derived from the world. So we took one of these cameras, the Microsoft Kinect, we plugged it into a laptop, threw it in a backpack with a security alarm battery and an inverter, and strapped a normal camera to it so we could take actual photos, like color. And we took this into the subway, and we started taking photos of space and place and people moving through the space. So this is Alexander with this image-making device, this lashed-up thing. I'm hiding off to the back with a Bluetooth mouse, clicking to take photos off of the Kinect. So we're collaborating that way. And the reason we chose this as a setting was we had heard a story at the same time about the security in the subway. And this is in the wake of, not that long actually, by comparison, after 9/11, and also very recently after the bombings in London in 2005. And so the MTA was very concerned, so the Transit Authority in New York was very concerned about security in the subway. So they put through a very rash measure to fund and produce this science fiction level surveillance system to protect the subways. And so this surveillance system was unprecedented in scale. It had hundreds more cameras than were normally available for viewing. And what made that possible was because these cameras, they weren't being fed into the normal guards where you see guards watching screens, but they were fed into computers. And their images were being watched by algorithms to detect threats. And the other interesting thing about this surveillance system is when they rolled it out, it didn't work. It failed all practical tests and resulted in lawsuits on both sides, where the MTA was claiming that they sold them vaporware, they sold them something before it had been developed, and then Lockheed Martin was saying that, well, you didn't give us access to the subway. And I think anybody in this room who's done some sort of vision tracking installations knows that, well, it worked in my studio, but now we're here and I don't know what's going on. So it's kind of like that, but times $2 billion or $250 million. And these are actually, I went and researched the hearing papers. It reads really well. You could definitely adapt this to a science fiction script or a thriller. Like the point behind the Lockheed contract is the MTA's testimony. It's an artificial intelligence system, and the system has failed. It's a failure. It's a total failure. We lost all this money. So, sort of a humorous end to this hubris of that system. But Alexander and I used that as a context to say, hey, what would this system have looked like? What if we could peer through the eyes of this machine? And can we use this nascent technology, this video game controller, to start to get at the ideas of what it looks like to see through the eyes of these systems and to make it something you can relate to? So we generated from those data captures this photo series. And it depicts, in a lot of ways, a hybrid between people existing as photographs, between something that we consider that discipline, and then also bringing in the language of computer graphics and data visualization of polygons and lines and color, and the intersection of those two. And it also starts to have that hint of the property that we were interested in, where you can take the same data set, like this data set, for instance, and look at it from a different angle and change the way it's perceived. So I became fixated on this concept of humans in a digital space. I really loved the fact that we could represent people existing in this natural way in these virtual environments. So along with another collaborator, a filmmaker named Jonathan Menard, we furthered the technology and actually brought it from the level of photography to the level of video. So we began to be able to capture video sequences with people using this hybrid format of a camera and a Kinect. And we first prototyped this system actually at a hackathon at Carnegie Mellon University during a residency where Jonathan and I were both there, where we met. And so the first subject matter for this format for us was interviews with artists talking about code, very similar to very much in an Eyeo spirit. But we found an amazing resonance where if you have a speaker talking about being experimental and creative with new technologies and creating visualizations using code, and then being represented by points of data in space, it was almost as if we were giving them the ability to create a self-portrait. Like, how does a data artist depict themselves? And so we ran with it, and we started with a few interviews, and we released a video online that was just a short sequence cut of those videos, and then we went and did another round, bringing it to 40 total interviews. And actually, a big portion of the interviews were done at Eyeo in 2012. And so that project amassed into this what's become an interactive documentary where the viewer can actually explore that space and navigate through this data visualization of ideas following their own curiosities. So that's where we've gone. And actually today, it's very exciting for me to announce, even a little bit emotional, because this has been like a 4-year project, that we are done with the film, and we finally realized the level that we had initially imagined, which is something that you can download and play yourself. So as of now, the website's live, and you can access Clouds and download it and play it on your laptop for the first time. So I have a little trailer that we'll show that introduces that.
In general, everyone in this community is used to sharing in some way.
Humans are connecting from across the planet and creating something larger.
I think you can equate building a tool and building a language.
It's almost like people across the planet are dreaming together.
Yay, finally. So, many of you may have been last year when we presented. Jonathan and I were here. We presented it actually on this stage, and we've also presented it elsewhere at festivals and galleries. But this release is very special. We were working on it super hard for the last several months because there's a new interface that lets you explore the content in a very different way, and I think it changes the project entirely. So we have what we call research mode now. And so there's the normal mode where you can go through the film and select questions, and it'll generate a sequence for you based on whatever question you select. And you sort of encounter things. It's like following curiosity. It's a discovery mode. And then now there's a much more directed way of experiencing the film, where you're given an interface where you can select a topic or pick it out of this tag cloud, which is an actual visualization of all the content within the film. So there's over 10 hours and 1,500 interview snippets. And you can select that and then dive in and get a very focused view of the film. And you can also select by person. So this actually is very similar to the book cover that Mort Stefaner did for Eyeo. So it's during the process of making Clouds, we harvested all the Twitter data that all the people in the film had, all the conversations they were having, and we visualized that. And then in a 3D space. So every node is a person, and every line represents a moment where they had an interaction. And we present this actually in Clouds as a navigational interface. So you can jump through this network and choose people and see who's closer to who, and then dive in to watch a focused interview with just them. It also functions a bit as an exhibition. So there's over 70 visualizations, many of which have been created by the people that we interviewed. Also, the expanded team have created more visualizations. They relate to the ideas and concepts in the theme. So, nervous system sitting in the front row, they created a commission. Casey, who's speaking, has 2 pieces. So this is one of the few places that you can actually get live generative art on your computer, downloaded from those artists, and it'll be different every time you watch it, and you can go back to it at any time. So it's kind of like a very, very fancy screensaver mode. And I want to just give credit. There's Ellie and Winslow are in the audience. This project has been a massive effort with over 30 people contributing, including in addition to the people we interviewed. So the people have been working very hard. So it's available in 2 different ways. You can download it and stream it. All the depth data and color data, this hybrid format is being served through a platform called VHX, which is a startup in Brooklyn, and they've been very gracious in creating a link between the application you download and their servers to watch the film. And also, if you want to watch it in offline mode, we've fabricated these glass steel etched USB keys that have the entire content of the film on it, so that you can plug it in and watch it that way. And it works on Windows and Mac. So we'll be selling these upstairs. Also, if you back the Kickstarter, and I owe you one of these for the last 2 years, you can pick yours up for free. We have a little list, and we just check your name off the list. So thank you for being patient. Also, on the web store, if you're downloading the Eyeo, or if you're downloading the streaming version, the code Eyeo will give you a discount too, and that's just for the period of the conference. So give it a try. If you find bugs, let me know. I'll be around. This is the first time we've let it out in the wild, so thank you. So back to the idea of this talk. I think there's one quote from Kevin Slavin from the film that's really resonated with the way we've taken our practice since Clouds and during the production. And he says casually what he notices as a trend going into the future, and that a shift is happening. And the shift is happening from artists making things that reflect their vision, the way that they see the world, to artists making tools that allow others to see the way that they see. And this was something that was motivating us. It was in the milieu that was exciting for us when we were playing with this format, that encouraged us to release this open source and freely available tool to allow other people to experiment with the same technologies and techniques that we were doing while we were creating Clouds and the depth editor debug pieces, the subway pieces. So this is, Alexander and I have been working on this quite extensively in that time, and it's a nonlinear editor for this type of format. It allows you to capture from the Kinect, calibrate it to an external camera, and export videos. And we're now working on retooling it actually to do more real-time things, more like what you see in Clouds, where you could actually bring it into a virtual reality environment or make it interactive or have it play through WebGL. So that's our current effort. But in doing this, we fostered a surprise, small but dedicated community of creative people who are also talking about these ideas. So we see the Depth Kit as almost like a science fiction encoded into software. This technology is not there yet, but having something tangible to play with and to experiment with is a great conversation starter for helping a community emerge to work together. And just on that spirit of the community, I want to take a moment to mention just we're not the only people working in this way. And there's a very nice set of media artists that are working on this idea of the camera of the future, whether they know it or not. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes to just show you some work that I think fleshes out this idea a little bit better and makes it more broad. So this is actually quite an old project. Clement Valla, who's an artist based in Brooklyn, in 2010, he created this thing called Postcards from Google Earth. And what Clement discovered was a glitch in how Google Earth worked. It was the fact that Google had created this way of flying throughout the world and taking photos of the world. You can go on a tour by taking satellite data and mapping it onto terrain data. But what this model of the world failed to account for were delicate architectural structures that were made by humans, such as bridges and dams and things like that aren't captured in the height data, but are obviously visible from satellites. So when you come off axis and you look at this mountainscape, you see these surrealist melted bridges going into valleys and canyons. And so in a way, Google Earth is claiming to be this camera of the future. They're saying, go anywhere, take a photo of anything, derive it like a search query. But then Clement, as an artist, is saying, actually, no, it's broken in this specific way. And by putting those glitches on display, we understand the underlying nature of these systems. I like to mention is Sophie Kahn. And so Sophie's work, if you were to just encounter it in a gallery, you might think that it's more based in the history of sculpture, or she's working as a sculptor. They're figurative, three-dimensional portraits of people, often in brass or bronze, sometimes in resin. But she's actually working with a camera. But this camera it's a little bit similar to the Kinect, but it's made for industrial applications for measuring parts for mechanical engineers. But she uses it to create portraits, and it requires her subjects to stay very, very, very still. And even in that case, they move a little bit, and there's glitches and things like that, and that come through the data. But she really highlights those facts because her subject matter is all about the frailty and ephemerality of life, and all her poses have to do with these transcendent things, people on the edge of life and death. And so she creates these marvelous sculptures that do exist somewhere between. Although they look like sculptures, they're derived in this photographic way. Another project, which is actually done as a music video, has similar themes, but is formally in the complete opposite direction. Instead of highlighting the glitches of these new techniques, it does its best to create something that's completely photoreal. So these guys, Marshmallow Laser Feast, they're an analog studio. They made a portrait of a woman on the edge of death was their concept for as a music video for a duologue. And this is done, it looks very real, but it's done from photo data. So the way that they capture these portraits is by putting a real person in a room and taking photos from every direction. And from that data, they're able to derive this high-resolution 3D model. And I like to look at this image and see then back to looking at that counter go up. If these were all uploaded, they would all increment that counter by however many cameras are there, 64 or 128. But that number isn't really relevant in this case because what they're getting at something that's beyond the sort of image of like the beyond a photo. They're getting at some deeper data by combining it with synthesis, by combining it with computer vision, and they're able to derive something greater than just the snapshot out of it. So I like starting to think about it this way. And another artist who probably wouldn't describe her work as photography, but I like to suggest that now. This is her camera. So Heather Dewey Hagborg is working with DNA. So she finds samples of DNA around on the streets, just in public, cigarette butts, hair follicles, whatever she can get her hands on. And using analysis, she's able to reconstruct an approximation of what that person could look like. So in some ways, takes a photo of that person, almost in the way that Sophie Kahn is doing it, but doing it entirely from estimations based on our knowledge of genetics. And this obviously has huge implications for surveillance technology and things like that, but it really undermines what our idea of a camera is, because what's the input and what's the output? So a camera, in some ways, is important because it creates a representation of the world based on its physical properties. This is doing that, but there's no lens or optics involved at all. So it starts to get at the question of what even a camera is and disrupt our idea of that. So as Alexander and I track all these work and have conversations with these artists, we wanted to be able to make work that was bigger than just what we were able to produce ourselves. So inspired by this nascent community, this growing community, we founded a studio last year together, and along with a third partner, Mei-Ling Wang, so there's three of us, and we call ourselves Specular. And the name is derived from, it's a shared concept, both in 3D graphics as well as in photography. It's kind of the look of wet skin, this sort of shining thing, but it really actually is interesting to us because it's view dependent. It depends on where you look, and sort of that you get this glossy effect. But the word specular actually means having the properties of a mirror. So we like the concept of having a medium that is reflecting back on us. So it's a way to understand, it's lenses through which to understand ourselves. And at the studio, we are doing a number of commercial projects. So we do commissions for clients mostly doing large-scale interactive installations, stuff like is talked at like Instant, those kind of projects, all involving vision and tracking technologies, but to make expressive experiences. But I want to skip over that work mostly to focus on the part that I'm really excited about with Specular, which is this concept of speculations. So this is the part of the website and the part of the practice where we're encouraging people more than ourselves. So they are our projects, but also we're bringing other people into the studio to make projects that really interrogate the meaning and the social implications of emerging technology. So, for instance, we had a resident. We call them speculators, actually. So we've like gone too far with this whole thing. But Facing the Nameless was produced by the National Film Board of Canada for the Haikus project that came out this year. But she worked with us in the studio, and we were production partners for that. And this middle one is the one I'm going to talk about now, which is one that we just published. Obviously, Clouds has been retroactively branded as a speculation. So this project that we just released is called Exquisite City, and it actually was so we sort of hijacked Resonate Festival workshop to create an art piece. Sort of they were complicit, but so it was done at Resonate Festival in Serbia just in April. And the Exquisite City, we came to this idea because we were interested in surrealism, and one of the earliest surrealist practices was the exquisite corpse. And many of you have done this, but it's the practice of taking the body, dividing it into sections from head to toe, and taking a piece of paper and folding it up like an accordion, and then assigning each fold one of these parts of the body. And then you have a bunch of people, it's like a parlor game, where one person draws the head and then folds the paper over, pans it to the next person. They can just see the little lines that have led from the last person's drawing, and then they draw the next part of the body without any knowledge of what had been drawn before. And when you unfold it, you get these very comical, surrealist, strange bodies of people that are these collaborative drawings. And we thought maybe, rush forward in sort of French art history 40 years to psychogeography, the Fluxus movement, the concept of psychogeography, that cities exist differently in our mind than they do in physical reality. This is maybe a representation of where, when you think about a city, it's actually not composed based on its geography, but more of how you inhabit the city. And the Fluxus movement had this practice called a derive, where you would walk through the city and really take note of the way that the architecture impacted and interfaced with the culture and how you thought of the city. So we wanted to combine these two ideas with emerging technology to see if, hey, can we represent the city that's in our minds rather than the city that's on the map? And we did that using a process called photogrammetry. So this is a very simple process where you take a lot of photos of something, like this mailbox in Bushwick, and you can derive a pretty good 3D model from it. So we took the participants of this workshop and we walked around the city in Resonate, and they captured the city into little chunks. So we went on a derive and we picked parts of the city. I see some pizza snuck in there, so some people were getting clever. But the idea was to capture the city in these little architectural units. And then once we all had those units, there's like Lego bricks, we took the neighborhood surrounding the festival and we divided the blocks up and gave them, so we assigned people to the different blocks and said, okay, you fill out this part, you fill out that part. And the result was an exquisite corpse at the scale of the city. So this is, and from that product, you could then go on a derive and walk through this virtual space. So in some way, Alexander's practice had come full circle as we did the documentation for this project, because he started as a street photographer in New York, and now all of a sudden he's walking through some strange video game, taking street photos at this in this space that otherwise didn't exist. So you could take this as a practice of street photography once you have this virtual space. And if you go to our website, you can download and walk through the city yourself. And we've also released all the materials for the workshop, so if you'd like to do it yourself or run a similar workshop, by all means, go for it. So we want to make it an open, we can keep expanding and do it in different locations. So this is just kind of an overview of what the city looks like. And to bring it back to the beginning, the process that we use to capture these little chunks of architecture, of taking many photos, was actually derived from, in a similar way as the other art projects we were looking at the very beginning, of Penelope Umberco, her Sons from Sunsets, and also Eric Kessel's, where there were researchers, computer science researchers at the University of Washington, that were excited about the possibility of huge databases of images online. And so they released a series of research called PhotoCity and also Phototourism, which downloaded databases of monuments that, of course, tourists take pictures of all the time, and we're able to reconstruct images of those using just the photos of that tourists had created. You could create a 3D model of the Eiffel Tower or the Colosseum. And so the basis for our ability to do that workshop was done from the scientific research and computer science research. And so then I'll finish with one final project that is done by Moritz Stefaner, who also created the book cover, and Lev Manovic, which is another documentation project. And this one is beautiful for me as a final note because it shows, explaining the project, Selfie City, they would be able to download selfies from any particular city, and from that, they could create a portrait of how that city thought of themselves, because this is how they represented themselves, and you would see these amazing trends from Sao Paulo to New York to Tokyo about how people depicted themselves. And getting back to this idea of the photographer, like the role and culture, it's at a point where this idea of documenting reality, of taking a picture, used to be something that was a specialist role, and now it's very general. Like, we all do this ourselves. So the photographer, that impetus has gone one level up in culture in a way, and the way to depict culture is now by amassing these photographs and taking pictures of the space that they exist in and deriving understanding from them. And then sometimes taking pictures of things that don't actually exist at all, but rather are something that we infer or imagine to be true in the way that we're communicating now on networks. So the photographer exists in a virtual space also. And with that, I'll do maybe 2 minutes of Q&A. So thank you for listening.
Knowing what you know now, having made clouds, would you do it again? Like, how would you change? If someone was
know
interested,
that the answer is absolutely no.
Yeah, no, I know. So how would you change things for Clouds 2?
I don't know. You just learn how long things take. I think that the expectation, what the struggle was in the project is constantly letting yourself down, that you say, oh, I'm going to do this by this amount of time, and then not being willing to compromise the project in order to get it out by the date you had promised. So I think if I've learned anything, it's just like, let things take a long time. And I think in general, actually, I would have not shown it as soon as we did. I think we showed it too soon in some situations, that felt like this was the moment, we had to get it out, this is our only chance, and that's never the case. Like, a good project will be good in a year, in 2 years. So that's my biggest life lesson is, just let things take their time, and don't promise, like what Dave's saying, like, don't make promises, don't say the date until you really feel like you're ready.
So the sensor side of things, I've been thinking a lot about different types of sensors and how you generate the realities that you could experience or have shared experiences with other people. I'm wondering what your view of a shared world would be in the future, and how that would be captured. Would this be something where you could see people's faces, interact with them, or is it more of like an archival experience?
I think there's always this sort of cyberpunk fantasy that never really will get there, about just like all hanging out on the holodeck. And I'm not really interested in that. But there are some interesting things that, like photographic representation in sort of a shared virtual space is interesting. And do you know those 3 dots that happen when you're texting with someone? Like, that is huge. so this idea of knowing that someone is thinking without making like a statement, and this accountability of what the other person is doing, like this sort of ambient awareness of the other, is like what we deal with when we're in real life. That's why conferences like Eyeo are great. So I think there will be something at some point where people will opt into a system that allows that ambience to be present. But whether it's done through like really high-powered graphics and things on your face, I'm not sure of. But I think that's what I'm really interested in, is that ambient understanding of somebody who's in a different space. And I don't know what technology will enable it, but I think that is an interesting space to work in terms of the social aspect of these things. Cool. Well, maybe that's it then. Thank you.